You're tuned into Tour Talk TV with your host, Mark Anthony.
I'm Mark Anthony. This is TourTalkTV.com and the podcast. On the other end of my Skype call is Stepen Fried. Hello, Stepen.
Hi.
Before we get to our main topic here, you've got an interesting birth of writing background. The one that stands out most is your articles on mental health. What got you into that?
I've done a lot of writing on mental health. The first big stories that I did for big magazine stories were about teenage suicide and about sexual abuse in small towns, actually not far from Philadelphia. And so I wrote about that for a long time. And then in the early 90s, this is actually somewhat known, my wife had a very severe adverse drug reaction to an antibiotic she took. And she had a manic reaction. She had a seizure. So this additionally obviously got me interested in writing about mental illness, about pharmaceutical industrial complex. So I've done a lot of writing in that area, then kind of stopped for a while, and actually now I'm doing more as well. I'm working on a new biography of Benjamin Rush, who was the father of American psychiatry. And I'm co-authoring a book with Patrick Kennedy on mental health politics.
Okay. It's just, I don't know if it's your presentation style or what, but you just give a different view to it, and I enjoy reading it. It caught my attention more than any other articles on that particular topic, or so I just wanted to say thank you for doing that.
Well, thanks. It's hard to get people interested in mental illness, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I've been fortunate to be able to do some stories that did bring some attention to these subjects, and I also do teaching about this too. I actually just spoke at a big conference about this, about how people who are both in the field and being treated by people in the field can communicate better about mental illness.
Yeah, well, you do a good job at it. And then the other one that caught my attention was Gia.
Gia.
A early supermodel, would you put her in?
Everybody wants to claim that they were the first supermodel. I guess we'll claim that Gia was the first supermodel. Gia was a extremely popular model in the 70s and early 80s from Philadelphia. Who died of AIDS in the middle 80s. And I did some magazine work after her death. She died of AIDS. She was a heroin addict, and which led to a book and then later the movie with Angelina Jolie. So there's a whole Gia thing online now of people who are obsessed with Gia. It's actually quite astonishing. But Gia was a fascinating character, and I'm glad that her story stands for something both in the world of drug abuse and mental illness and in gender. Gia was gay. She's one of the first openly gay famous women in America. So it's cool that her story is out there and that people are still coming to it.
Good. All right. And then somehow we got from that to Fred Harvey.
Yeah, I never want to write about the same thing twice. So the more different the thing is from the last thing I wrote about, the better. And so certainly the Fred Harvey project was also my first big history project. So I had to teach myself how to be a history writer.
Oh, well, see, for us out here on the West Coast that do the tours into like the Grand Canyon and all that, Fred Harvey has always been this mystical person. We go into the Fred Harvey stores, or we go into, again, yesterday I was up at the south rim of the Grand Canyon, and you always see this, but nobody ever knew who he was. What got you into him?
Grand Canyon. I mean, it's not a big surprise. I mean, my wife and I went to the Grand Canyon in 1993. Typical tourists, we planned to spend 23 hours there, which is more than enough time to see everything from what I had guessed sitting in my office in Philadelphia. And so we went to the Grand Canyon. We stayed at El Tovar, and we saw Fred's portrait next to where you queue up to go get breakfast. And when we got in our room, there was like a little Fred Harvey pamphlet, and we started seeing Fred Harvey's name all over the place, and we went to Painted Desert after that. And at Painted Desert, they had the last big Fred Harvey stores and signs. And my wife just finally turned to me and said, "Who the hell is Fred Harvey?" But that was actually quite a long time before I wrote about it. I mean, at that time, I thought it would be an interesting slice of Americana to maybe write for a travel magazine. In the 90s, there was not a whole lot of activity going on. This is the early 90s. And so, I really sort of put it aside for a very long time, not really knowing what was happening out in the West. And then truth is, after 9/11, a lot of people started getting interested in American history again, including the editors at my publishing house. And so we started talking about history-related books. And when they asked me what history book I would write if I was going to write a history book, I said I would write a biography of Fred Harvey. At that time, honestly, I knew as little about Fred Harvey as most everybody else did. I mean, you're right, the Fred Harvey story was really very much put out as a legendary story by the Santa Fe. And because Fred himself and his son chose to blur the time that Fred died as a marketing tool. So Fred died in 1901, but the company continued to refer to itself as Fred Harvey, not the Fred Harvey Company. All their material said, your host is Fred Harvey, as if Fred Harvey was still alive. So they actually deliberately did that to make people think that Fred Harvey was like this mythic kind of like, Wizard of Oz kind of guy who lived on forever. So it wasn't surprising that when I got to the books that had been written, there were a lot of mistakes. Some of it was from Santa Fe PR. Some of it was just made up, and it's become part of legend. So we decided to do sort of investigative reporting on Fred Harvey, on the Santa Fe Railroad, look at everything again to see what was true. And also what you do in a book like this is that you try to find everything that's interesting. So everything that's interesting about the people's work, everything that's interesting about their private lives, everything that happened during the time when they were alive that you have access to write about. So we really try to, throw a big umbrella over it. And Fred Harvey Company was a massive company in America from the 1870s up through the Second World War. I mean, it continued later, but those were its glory days. That's a lot of glory days.
Yeah.
That's 3 generations of Harveys. That's 3 generations, 4 generations, 5 generations of Harvey girls. So it's a lot of history to take in, to get right, and then to figure out how to write in a very easy to read way, because you don't want to write it just for the people, just for the Fred heads who will read anything,
right?
But the people who never heard the story before, to introduce them to it. So that was really the goal.
Now, was this going to be just like a wham bam 1 or 2 year project that kind of
Yeah, it kind of got out of control. It was supposed to be 2 years. I mean, every book you sign up for is supposed to be 2 years. This one ended up being 6 years. For a variety of reasons, some of which had to do with the book, some of which had to do just with life getting in the way.
Right.
But it also took a really long time to find a lot of things. I mean, Fred Harvey was well covered up. Even the family members who we spent a lot of time with ultimately didn't know that much about their grandfather or great-grandfather.
Right.
There was a lot of piecing things together, going through archives that people hadn't spent a lot of time with. And also, it's a funny story because the Fred Harvey Company, being the first chain of anything in America, truly extended from Chicago all the way to the Pacific Ocean and all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And in each of those towns, you heard a different version of the Fred Harvey story, because part of the genius of the company was to be a chain, but to make local people feel like it was a local concern.
Yeah, and
so for that reason, people had their local versions of these stories, some of which were true, some of which weren't true. But it's one thing if you're dealing with a story where you're dealing with a person's hometown and where they worked.
Right.
When you're dealing with 80 cities and trying to figure out which stories you can tell in depth.
Right.
Wasn't easy.
Okay, well, and Fred, I mean, when you get into the story, which is a really good book, Fred started a lot of trends. I mean, he was in front of a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what Fred did was he solved a lot of problems that were obvious problems that no one had solved. So it was very clear that in the West there were no dining cars, and all the restaurants along the tracks were generally owned by local people who didn't care if they ripped you off because they knew they were never going to see you again.
Right.
So Fred's goal was for that not to be true. He believed, very strongly in a level of customer service which honestly wasn't really in America yet.
Nope.
Certainly not for common people. And so he figured the only way to do that would be as if all the restaurants were owned by the same company, and then if you use the fact that the trains were moving back and forth between them to bring fresher food. So this seems like a very obvious thing, but it's a logistical nightmare until you get it figured out. And it requires a different business model because, again, the way these restaurants were owned before that was they were leased out to local people who ripped off the people coming through town.
Yes.
So once Fred decided that he would have this chain, they tried to solve lots of problems within the chain. So they were always looking for ways to serve better. The Harvey Girls were invented as a way both to improve service, to centralize the hiring of waiters and waitresses, and in this case, make them all women because they thought it might lower the testosterone level in the Western restaurants.
Right.
In terms of the food, it started out being very simple, but as the company grew and there were more places and people got more demanding, they learned how to cook different kinds of food. So in the heyday of the company, they went from selling beefsteaks and eggs and just, sort of very straightforward stuff. These restaurants were the place that you might be for the first time exposed to international cuisine, American regional cuisine, ingredients that you never saw before. So they took the idea, they took advantage of what was available to them, and they kept doing the right thing for generation after generation, and really had an amazing system that people all over the world looked at. When we looked through the correspondence of the Fred Harvey Company, what was amazing was every hotel and every railroad were reaching out to the Harvey Company saying, couldn't you take over our hotel and bring what you're doing, hotels in the East, places in Europe and Asia, because this was a famous thing. We're used to chains now, and we're used to good chains and bad chains. At that time, there were no chains. The idea that you could have a chain and it made things better was a pretty revolutionary idea. It was developed by Fred, developed by the people around him at the highest level, by his son, by his right-hand man, David Benjamin. Fred did not need all the credit himself. He was a great delegator. He believed in smart people and let them do their job.
Right. Now, we got onto the fact that he solved our problems, but he also, to many people, he's the reason we have people west of the Mississippi, because he brought all these fresh young girls out here, and he kind of settled the West.
He did settle the West. It's not like there were no people out here,
No.
But there were people out here working, and there generally were not families out here necessarily yet. There were not all the working women who were out here were working in the sex trade.
Right.
So I think that the idea that he and the railroad put out there was that these towns needed to be towns, and they needed to have real life. And so the Harvey Company, pretty early on, besides hiring Harvey Girls, they started having dances on Friday nights. So there was actually something nice to do in the town that didn't involve drinking and vomiting. And so they were actually quite interested not only in doing good business, but in helping these towns be more civilized.
Right.
And so they were very deliberate about that. When they had this technique that would work in a different place, when they opened in a new place, the town expected that was going to be the case. And they were always bringing in new dance partners. I mean, here's a company that on top of everything else is bringing, every time a local girl gets married who works for the Harvey Company, they're bringing in another single girl to come and work there.
Right.
So they are civilizing in all different kinds of ways. And a lot of these Western towns, especially the smaller ones that were all invented by the railroad, were settled by railroad people marrying Harvey Girls and raising families there. That's part of the reason why there's such a rich Fred Harvey heritage. Even though a lot of the people who are our age don't know it, because but their parents and their grandparents grew up hearing about this, and most of them still grew up going to the local train station to eat their nice holiday meals and big family meals and stuff like that, because that's when the train station was the center of town. That's where they went. Harvey's controlled all the food and all the retail in those train stations.
Now, your writing of Fred Harvey opened up a lot of doors for a lot of people, and there seems to be a resurgence of Fred Harvey, or the Harvey nostalgia, with the hotel in Winslow, the one in New Mexico, and is it because of the book? Is the book part of that, or did you just kind of catch on to something that was bubbling under the surface?
It was totally already happening. I mean, I don't think that anybody had added so much to the research about Fred Harvey, but the process of the Fred Harvey places being saved totally predated my interest in this. I mean, keep in mind that it was in the mid-'90s that the Heard Museum in Phoenix had its first big Fred Harvey show. That's also when Alan Afeld and Tina Mione moved from Los Angeles, to take over La Posada in Winslow and begin bringing it back literally brick by brick. So that process had already started, and people were already looking into what else could be done. When I got interested in this, around 2003, it seemed like it had sort of plateaued in that La Posada was done. Obviously, La Fonda and Santa Fe was still operational, and a wonderful hotel, as were all the hotels at the South Rim and the Grand Canyon. But it wasn't clear what would be next. So I would like to think that what the book brought was an influx of, first of all, enthusiasm. I mean, I'm a pretty enthusiastic guy, and I've been out there giving lots of talks about this. I think it's a cool story that more people should know about. But it also brought information. And I think that to some degree, the early things that had been done, a lot of them were built on either the romanticized version of Fred Harvey that people had heard, or a limited amount of information. And there were, the books that existed there, while they were very beautiful and in some cases smart, they didn't have some of the information that we were able to dig up. I mean, I had researchers reading daily newspapers in Leavenworth, Kansas, and Las Vegas, New Mexico, for every day for years. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that you can do when you have a book contract and you teach at a university and students will come help you with your project that, not everybody gets to do. So I was really fortunate that the people who, the two groups of people, the people who let the places not get knocked down. Okay, in most of these Fred Harvey towns, you have people who for years just kept saying, like, someone will come. Someone will save La Posada. Someone will save the Castaneda, Yeah. And it was mostly people who had grown up in these places who didn't want to let them get knocked down, like the Alvarado was in Albuquerque. And God bless them, and most of them are still alive, and it's been wonderful to see them have the aftermath of La Posada. And look, they just sold the Castaneda in Las Vegas, which is the other dream hotel save, and that hotel's being saved even as we speak by Alan and Tina, the people who own La Posada. So, what my goal was to take the Fred Harvey story and turn it into a living history again, both in terms of the book that I would write and to reinvigorate people's interest in it as readers, but also for them to see that, the Fred Harvey Company was the company that basically brought people to the West. They invented Western tourism. They invented Western tourism in New Mexico and Arizona, in Southern California. I'm going to be speaking in Las Vegas pretty soon. I didn't realize this, that your first mayor in Las Vegas was a former Fred Harvey chef who came to the West, on the trains cooking for Fred Harvey, ended up being in Las Vegas, which was not, I believe, attached to the trains by that time. I could be wrong. Not to the Santa Fe, at least. The idea of Las Vegas is built on the idea that you can create these oases in the middle of nowhere if people can get to them. Right. You have incredible service and serve incredible food. And so your mayor, who began getting involved with this at the turn of the century, was able to look and see what the Fred Harvey Company and the Santa Fe Railroad had already been doing for 25 years in places that were just as desolate as Las Vegas was when it started. And that if they became places that were worth coming to, where you'd be taken care of royally, where you'd be able to eat food that you wouldn't be able to eat in your own town, that would be a cool thing. And it would be a way of connecting with powerful mythology of the West, which, let's face it, most of us know about like a little bit in Cowboys and Indians way, but we don't know that much about. So what the Harvey Company also did is tell the story. I mean, part of the reason that we know a multicultural version of the Western story, about white people and Native Americans and Hispanics living together and developing the Western part of the country, is because the Fred Harvey Company told that story itself privately. Because if you looked at the way people were telling that story before the Harvey Company got involved, it was as prejudiced and frightening as you would expect the original people who came out to the West to be. So it's actually the process of Americans seeing America, the real America, right, the multicultural America. That was not done by the government. The government wasn't big enough then. It was actually done by the Fred Harvey Company and the Santa Fe, who were explaining the American West to Americans, to Europeans, to all the people who wanted to come. And eventually they all wanted to come to the Grand Canyon. I mean, they had many other hotels, but as soon as the Grand Canyon happened, the Grand Canyon became the centerpiece because it was so much more popular than everything else. And it's not surprising that the Grand Canyon, Santa Fe are what's left, and then a handful of the smaller hotels.
Right. You talk about the multiculturalism. One of the people that was instrumental in that is Mary Jane Coulter, which really, when I read what you wrote about her, opened up a whole new world on how you think about the Grand Canyon and architecture and the early 1900s. She was she was way ahead of her time, just like the Fred Harvey Corporation was.
Yeah, Mary Jane Coulter was a woman who worked in Minneapolis doing store design and doing a little bit of teaching. The Harvey Company found her and brought her in initially as a young interior designer to design the rooms in Albuquerque in what became a small Indian museum in the train station. They later hired her full time, and she began designing incredible buildings, incredible interiors. She's basically credited with the sort of national park aesthetic that we see at all national parks in terms of the building design. And she was able to create these incredible buildings at the Grand Canyon, incredible buildings in other places like La Posada in Winslow. And she's also a fascinating person. I will say that while we have learned a lot about Fred Harvey, Mary Coulter is still pretty mysterious. She kept to herself. Even her biographer, Arnold Burke, who I sometimes am on panels with, we're still trying to find out stuff about her because she was all about work. Yeah. At least that's the public face she put out there. So her work is endlessly fascinating. She worked incredibly hard. I mean, I spent a lot of time with the Harveys who knew her, but people knew her that well personally, and we don't know what she was like personally that much, except she was incredibly tough-minded, incredibly funny and smart, but never married. And we don't know that much about her personal relationships, but what we know is that she created amazing buildings and really wanted the experience of traveling in the West to be architecturally challenging and smart, but also to be culturally accurate. And so here's a white woman from the Midwest who really, probably more than anybody else, even within the Harvey Company, insisted that the way that we tell the story of Native American America be accurate and not be this, hokum version that had been sort of put out there before. And her involvement with this, even to the point of creating a faux building that were closer to where the trains were, so you could actually experience what it was like to be involved in Native American life, it's an incredible thing that she decided to do. And luckily, those buildings are still very much alive. You go to the Grand Canyon, you go to the Desert Watchtower today, it's still like the Sistine Chapel of the Southwest,
yep,
like it was the day that she finished it. And it looks like it's 10,000 years old, even though it was built in the 1930s.
I have to say, for the people that I take up to the Grand Canyon, and I tell the Fred Harvey story, of course I hustle your book.
That's good.
The funniest reaction I get is from the women because of the fact that Mary Jane Coulter was in a man's world.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, she persevered and she built this. But she built this because Fred Harvey let her build that. And Fred Harvey was very, like we said earlier, he was in head of the curve solving problems. He wasn't, I don't think he set out to do everything that he did. It just, there was a problem there that always needed to be solved, and he solved it.
Well, keep in mind that Fred Harvey was dead before Mary Coulter built anything. Fred Harvey's son, Ford, who ran the company longer than Fred, is actually the one who enabled all of Mary Jane Coulter's buildings. But keep in mind that Mary Coulter was not the only woman in a man's world. What was cool about the Fred Harvey Company is that she was not the only high-ranking female executive. I mean, the company recognized from the very beginning that all genders and all races needed to be part of their business. And it was two British guys, and a Jewish guy from England running the company, with a lot of chefs from Italy and Switzerland and Harvey girls from all over the world. And both Mary Coulter on the design side and the head of personnel was also a woman. And so the company was pretty radical for its day. But their attitude was, we're gonna give the best people the opportunity to do their job, which is smart management in 1876, and it's smart management today.
Right. Where did you come up with the title?
Appetite for America. Here, I'll put up. This is the paperback version.
Okay. All right.
The original title for the book was Fred Harvey's America, and ultimately we had this big debate about whether enough people knew who Fred Harvey was, put Fred Harvey's name in the title. And so once you decide that the original title for your book you're not going to use, even though it's been on like every piece of paper since the book proposal, you begin this ridiculous process of listing every title you can think of in the world, as does your wife, all your family members, your editor, the publisher, the publicist, and anybody you talk to at the gym. We literally went through for weeks and weeks and weeks alternative versions. There was one really frightening one the publisher tried to put on me, which was Guns, Girls, and the Railroad. Really horrible title. So Appetite for America, what it all said and done was just a phrase that I made up. It was on my list, and the more we looked at it, the more we thought it was a cool title that would make people think about a lot of different things. Because obviously, Fred Harvey, besides being involved in the food business, he had an appetite for a bigger part of America than just food. I mean, he really introduced Americans to America in a way that somebody born here never could have. He had a fascination for the country, especially the Midwest and West, that I'm not sure people in America had that level of fascination with. Keep in mind, this is a time period when Americans, when they made money, they all wanted to go to Europe. The idea that America was exotic, that America was a place to explore, see America first. This stuff was all really starting. And part of the reason that we knew America was going to make it as a multinational, as a big power, is at the turn of the century in the early 1900s, when people start coming to America more than going away. And Fred Harvey was actually there for the perfect moment, which was at the beginning of the First World War. The war started in Europe, and people couldn't go to all the places they had gone to for Europe for like 3 years. So they started coming to America, and there was a World's Fair in America in 1915, two of them actually in the West. Those World's Fairs and the confluence of the First World War preventing people from going to Europe really was the turning point in American tourism. And after that, people got in the habit of seeing their own country, and people all over the world got in the habit of coming to America. It's part of the reason the National Park Service had to be created around then, because there was all of a sudden all these people wanting to see all these places that weren't parks yet. And really is causing an explosion of people being interested in America, so that after the First World War in the 1920s, that's a big part of life here that never changes, just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Cool. All right. Well, I appreciate your time with us. What's next for you?
I am working on another historical book set here in Philadelphia. I'm writing a biography of Dr. Benjamin Rush. So Benjamin Rush was the founding father of American medicine. He was best friends with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. He was also their doctor. So he signed the Declaration of Independence. He offers a great view of the entire Revolutionary period and the early years of the country through a really interesting prism that no one's really looked at very hard. And we're actually having an incredibly great time working on this. The only bad side is, the good thing about Appetite to America is that we had to go to Santa Fe and to Grand Canyon all the time and be out in the West.
Yeah.
And I literally live about 4 blocks from where Benjamin Rush lived and from the hospital that he went to. So I don't get a lot of traveling, but all the stuff that I need to look at is right nearby.
Okay. So the book is Appetite for America, and then that was now we also have a DVD out on the Harvey Girls. That was produced by Mary Parker.
Tina Parks, a really wonderful filmmaker, decided to make a documentary on the Harvey Girls. It's called The Harvey Girls Opportunity Bound. I'm in it. A number of Harvey girls who were still alive were captured. Some of them who she interviewed aren't with us anymore, so it's actually quite wonderful.
Oh, neat.
Showing up PBS stations around the country. It was a finalist for the James Beard Award this year. We're very proud of that. So the DVD is out there, and you can hear me talking more about Fred Harvey and a lot of other people. And we're also been very interested in Fred Harvey cooking. So we actually have a website called the Harvey Girls Cookbook. It's up on Facebook too. And we are gathering every original Fred Harvey recipe we can find. We have over 1,200 of them.
Just for anyone that goes there, be careful, because your arteries are, it's great food, but back then they cooked.
Well, they had a little more lard in their diets than we do now, but we're also encouraging people to try the recipes and take the lard out of them.
Yeah.
We've just been trying to post a recipe every day and get people interested in it. But a number of Western chefs have started cooking the recipes, and we're hoping some people in Las Vegas actually will, but certainly they already make them at the Grand Canyon. They make them in Winslow. They make them in Santa Fe sometimes. But, our dream is that there will be a Harvey Girls cookbook that will be a combination of all these old Fred Harvey recipes and the biographies that we're writing about the early chefs and early Harvey Girls. That's like our side Fred Harvey project right now.
All right. Well, Stepen Fried, I appreciate your time. I thank you, and I look forward to meeting you again.
Great. It's great talking to you.
Thank you. Oh, and all of the links will be up on the website. So got it. All right.